This is ThriveCasters,
Thriving, not surviving.
tackling youth issues that matter to you.
Welcome to this week's episode of ThriveCasters, where we'll be discussing girls and gangs. And your hosts today are Ashlee Elizabeth Lolo, which is me, and we also got Hannah Galloway with me as well. So we're co-hosting today. And we're joined with Shardia Briscoe-Palmer, lecturer of race, media and social justice at the University of Leicester. Shardia, it'd be lovely to know a little bit more about what you do at the University of Leicester and in your role as a lecturer as well. So handing over to you, go for it.
Good evening. Before I start, I am going to have to correct you. It's the De Montfort University in Leicester.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and obviously there's a difference because, you know, there's two completely different locations. But my role there now is a lecturer in media, race and social justice, and I work quite closely with the Stephen Lauren Research Centre, homing in on those race-based issues, those racially charged discussions that we need to have, and tackling research on that subject matter. So for me specifically, I've also run this year at the university, this is the first time it's been run, a module on race and media, undergraduate second year module on race and media, which was a delight to lecture on and mark and assess and so on. And at the moment, yeah, that's me.
Brilliant. Okay. So according to a BBC article published in 2019, figures analysed by Children's Commissioner's Office suggested that 1/3 of young people involved in gang activity are girls. However, only 18 girls identified in the Metropolitan Police database of gang members. So there's something wrong there completely. So these figures suggest that girls are being overlooked and are exploited in the crime system, and it's going to continue if it's not addressed. So I suppose our first question is, from your experience and your research, what do you know about the roles of girls in gangs, and also why is it not as widespread knowledge as it is, for example, with our male counterparts? So over to you.
I would say first thing is that we often use, you know, the term girls, and often a girl is associated or seen as a little girl, you know, fully dressed, probably primary school and so on and so forth. But actually who we're talking about is teenagers and young women. And I think that narrative needs to change so that society is able to visualize who exactly are we speaking about. Women's roles in gangs can stem from or spread across having women gangs, so mainly women in these gangs, but then the roles of women and young women in gangs can also be in the stance of, you know, the mother or someone in the family, the sister, or, you know, the girlfriend or something like that. So I think sometimes, you know, data is not captured because of the terminology that's being used, and who specifically we're actually talking about is not necessarily understood by society and those capturing the data.
So do you feel that like these women are more victims or perpetrators, or do you feel like you can't really say they're more one or the other?
I think when we think about victims, so if we're talking about girls, then these girls have to be victims. If they're girls, if they're under 16, and therefore the law is saying that they do not have the legal age to consent to some of the crimes that they're being, you know, accused of or involved in, and therefore there has to be manipulation, exploitation and so on and so forth, then they would fall, and we're talking about girls because that's the language that's being used, they would automatically fall into victimhood. But then again, it's who exactly, are you on about the 14-year-old, you know, holding something for somebody? Is that person a victim or a perpetrator? Are we talking about the 19-year-old living in a house, knowing exactly what's going on in that house? You know, does that individual, does that female become a victim or a perpetrator? even the girls that are there as recruiters, and they're recruiting, you know, either more girls or boys/men to become and join and do activities in these gangs, you know, are they being held at some type of, you know, ransom while they're involved in, you know, this recruitment in the first place? So I don't think it's as simple to say, are they victims or perpetrators? I think you need to look, you know, what's going on behind the scene and exactly where are they being placed, and then who's controlling them, who's basically, you know, controlling those puppet strings.
I think that's quite interesting what you said about control, because that leads to the next question, which is, do you see love and relationships playing a massive part of why women and young women get into gangs, and why it's harder for them to escape the cycle of criminal violence and also escaping the stigma of being in a gang as well? But from your experience and your research, have you seen that play a role within it?
I think that love is a hard one, isn't it? And I think if you bring it back to where you first learn about love, that whole parental love, whether it's mother, father, you know, even grandparents, that's where you learn the definition, the concept, actual feeling about love, because automatically you can think it's kind of like, you know, a sexual relationship love, but actually for many young women, it's actually just the need to be loved in some way, shape or form, or seeking that parental love from somewhere. So it's not necessarily in the first instance a sexual love. However, it can develop, and often does develop, into a sexual transaction, and the word love, or the feeling of love, is kind of, not, I don't want to say thrown around, but exhibited and experienced and so on. And then the conversation becomes, actually, is it love, or is it just you're comfortable in a space, and therefore, or someone is providing you with something, whether that's materialistic or emotional, something that you've never had before, but you've been longing for and seeking and so on, and therefore the word love comes into play. You know, speaking with some young women and girls, they will argue down to the ground that they are in love with that individual. That is their boo, that is their bae, and you cannot tell them any different, even though they know, and you know, as practitioners, we are very aware that they have a few boos around the city, if not, you know, the region. So again, I think it's too easy to say, you know, love is controlling this. However, that need for love, or need for affection, attention, to be looked after, I think that definitely threads through a lot of the motives behind why girls, young women, join gang or get involved in gang affiliated activities.
That's really interesting. And I think, especially with your experience, especially around race as well, what role does race play in potentially rehabilitating young women when they're finally out of that life, or when they're seeking help? Does race play a factor in it, when it's like in terms of giving help to those who need it in that space?
I think, you know, race, and especially in the current climate that we're going through, in the current discussions and arguments, race plays a massive role. Race is always at the forefront of everything. It's just that, you know, those with the power that be, or the decision maker, the policy makers, up until this point, have never really seen race as a factor. And I would go a bit further to say it's not just race, it's culture, it's environment, it's understanding where that individual has been brought up and what environment and so on. And it's also just not a black thing. And that's another thing, that's another narrative that needs to be corrected. You know, gangs is not a black thing. And, you know, there's always statistic that goes around, and, you know, key speakers within society and also presenters within the mainstream media like to put forward, well, you know, statistics in London. However, you know, if you look at the demographics in London and so on and so forth, but you go, I don't know, 25 miles out of London, and that gang is a completely different ethnicity and race. And it's across the whole of the UK, and not just England, you know, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland as well, Northern Ireland as well. But in regards to the recovery, after someone has gone through that, I think it's with all types of intervention that cultural understanding and racial acknowledgement needs to play a part in what type of intervention you're putting in place. You need to understand why somebody cannot do X, Y, Z, or why somebody's mother would have said that comment. It's a cultural thing rather than to treat all 16-year-olds the same. You can't do that. We don't do that in school. We know about differences and we accept those differences. But for something like this, gang culture, criminal activity, race doesn't seem to have a narrative in this whole conversation. I would actually acknowledge, though, that, in the present climate, that, anyone who doesn't acknowledge race is just not listening at them. You're being quite ignorant if you kind of can't see where race has a place in this discussion.
I think it's all such present and current things that you're talking about, and so important. I think as well, like the why, you need to look at the why behind everything is really important as well. So with that in mind, like, do you think that gangs need young women or girls, or why do you think that they might, if they do?
I think that women definitely have a role to play within gangs. That's historical, and when my colleague and I at Sabre Snape did the research on girls in gangs, we looked at it from a historical standpoint in order to understand where we are today. And gangs have been, in the forefront of all of our histories. But another thing that we did is strip down that meaning and that definition of gang. And then you start to understand it's just a large collective of people. However, society, if you add any kind of antisocial behaviors in that, it then becomes, a gang. And yes, there are organized gangs across the whole of the UK that I'm not going to ignore. But in regards to the why and the how somebody would even fall into a gang, become a member of a gang, I think you have to look into that. It's very important. Many reasons are exploitation. A lot of these young people, if this is the core group we're focusing on, a lot of young women and men, boys, are being exploited and don't realize that they're being exploited into a gang situation, and just think it's just friendship or kindness, or he likes me, or well, so and so is doing it, so why can't I? However, there are some that actually know exactly what they're doing to a point. And I say exactly what they're doing to a point because, again, if you start to look at the age of consent and what age can young people start to mentally consent to certain activities, some are doing it because actually they know what they can get out of it themselves. And for some, it's materialistic. For some, actually, it's regular food on the table to feed whoever's at home or themselves. So to look at the why somebody would do that, why somebody would, join a gang, and then also carry out certain activities in that setting is extremely important. And I think, a one size fits all cannot be the answer. I think a policy, coming from the top down is definitely not the answer. That policy needs to be informed by the people on the ground and research. And you need to speak to those individuals in the gangs, and often the voices of women are not heard. The voices of the females in the gangs are not heard. And if they are heard, it's through, again, that victimhood narrative. And, they could be a victim. And more than likely, if we're talking about young women, they've been exploited, but their voices and roles and so on, unless it's like a BBC 2 documentary, it's just, it's not being discussed as it needs to be throughout the interventions that are happening.
I think it's quite interesting what you said about it being on the grassroots level, because my question was going to be like, what can the government do to try and help raise more awareness about it? But then now I think about it, when they were raising awareness about, for example, like the chicken shop gang, affiliations and what they did there, and look how insensitive that was. And it's like they just didn't take any notice about what people really needed. So I definitely do think that it's the grassroots organizations that potentially like have the power. And I was just wondering, do you know of any that are in Birmingham or in the West Midlands that we should be more aware of, that are on the ground helping young women come out of that life, or basically raising awareness about what that life entails if someone's considering it?
I think, what you said about the using the chicken shop as an example was really good, because you don't even have to be young. If you're eating your chicken and chips, you're not looking in the box at the end, it's going in the bin. So the millions that they spent on that, if the government would have spoken to these key workers, the youth workers, those people that have genuine daily interactions with young people on the street of Birmingham and other major cities, then actually you could have come up with some type of initiative to try and tackle this situation. In regards to, organisations specifically in Brum, do you know what I like about Birmingham is that they don't discriminate against, like the charities, the organisations, the cities, they don't discriminate against gender. So it's not necessarily a women's specific organisation that's only tackling girls and gangs and that's it. We're trying to tackle youth violence as a collective, and I think that's important. And you've got key figures in the community that we all know of and we all see. They're the ones that you need to speak to. They're the ones that you need to actually have at the table and listen, and actually give them the roles in local government or on local panels. And they are on, some of them are on them, and I'll give them the government credit for that. But it's not enough. And speak to the young people. I think in my experience working with young people always ask, oh, how do you work with them? How did you get 250 young people to take part in your project, or something like that, or consultation? And the basic answer is ask them. Go into a youth setting and ask them. Believe me, they have more than enough to say, and they want to share because they don't feel like they're heard or listened to. And ask some young people. Sorry, Hannah, did you say something? Okay. Yeah, and I find, I've always found that frustrating, and that's not even gang related specific. That's to do with any initiative that involves young people. Go and ask the people that you're trying to help. And the government have the best intentions, and the police commission have the best intentions, but it's almost like you have so much money, you don't know what to do with it. And we're fed up of tick box exercises, and we're fed up of you using the same organizations that actually you've been using for 10 years and we've seen no change. So why don't you give probably more newly established organizations that have new data, have new connections, have a new fire and a flame? And we know if you continue to use the same people all the time and you're not seeing any outcomes, it becomes just stale. The way that they're doing it is stale, and they may not see that the way that they're intervening is not working or stale, because at the end of the day, the council, the government keeps throwing money at them. So why not do exactly the same? But actually, real statistics, real data, we're not seeing anything different. And COVID has shone a light on the realities of society, and gang and criminal activity is one of the strands that it's shone a light on, because it didn't stop. They found a way to still carry out their activities through whichever way means they chose to do so, and the same with other strands of society and so on. But in regards to COVID, so there straight away, the government needs to go straight in and talk to those people on the ground. If you want to make change, sitting in Parliament don't make no difference in regards to real changes. Parliament, you can have an influence on policy and what projects are being put in there, and in some sense even funding and bids and so on. But the real change when, you know, you meet a young girl, I don't know, 14, and when you meet her, she's so deep within that setting, that environment, her situation. And working with that individual for 6 months, for 12 months, getting to know her circle, on many occasions getting to know the parents. And then 12 months later, you hear, you know what, I came out of that. I'm actually going to college, blah, blah, blah. That's the difference. Those are the people that you need to talk to, because you need to understand, how on earth did you achieve that? And often it's achieved with very little money. Very little money. Everybody is not, you know, a youth worker. Everybody doesn't know how to speak to young people and work with young people. However, there are people out there that do, so use them with their expertise and specialities. You wouldn't find me in a lab trying to create some, you know, treatment for some illness out there. That's not my speciality. There are people that have been doing this for years. There are people that have been in gangs themselves, come out and turn their lives around and want to offer their expertise and knowledge. That's who you need to be talking to. That's who you need to be using.
It's so important, like the help, as you said, like from youth workers or people that have gone through it themselves, who can like provide guidance. It reminds me of like preventing ACEs, or like in order to prevent them, or if somebody had got a lot of ACEs, like knowledge about it and what to do to like self-soothe and heal. And as well, what you said about Birmingham being like genderless when they're like trying to reduce youth crime, that's really, really good. But have you, like in your time, have you ever seen like many gangs without guys, kind of just like a gang full of women, or like girls or young women? Have you ever seen that?
Women only gangs, they're there. You'd be silly to think they're not there. And, you know, women only, I say women only, there's always women in the men's, and there's always a man in the women's, and so on. It'd be, you know, it's very rarely that you just see just women. And, you know, women can cause as much harm, shall I say, as, you know, the male gangs do. Maybe their weapon of choice is a little bit different. And therefore the data doesn't get captured exactly the same. But the thing that I find quite interesting is, it's almost like unless somebody is murdered, getting shot on the street, causing a really extreme fuss, then it's not seen as something that needs dealing with. However, you get groups of girls that are out there, you know, in doing criminal activity, doing exactly what the male gangs are doing, and they don't get the same acknowledgement because they didn't use a gun. They used their fists, and therefore it's just seen as a street fight with a group of girls. But it was an organised street fight, and it's a group of girls that go around the borough doing the exact same thing. And actually, if you look behind that group of girls, there's some criminal activity there. But it just doesn't get captured the same way. And I think, you know, the fact that the data that you said right at the beginning of this, girls are just not captured in the same light at all. And I think that's a broader narrative of, you know, women always being seen as victims and soft, and oh, they're there, it's not their fault. However, if you really want to tackle what on earth is going on in Birmingham or the UK as a whole, you need to capture this data. You need to actually stop putting it down to just a normal brawl or, you know, just an argument in the street, and actually call it what it is. It's gang activity, and therefore funds need to be pushed towards that issue. But at the moment, it's not really seen as a big issue because the data's not there. Policy gets written because of research. Research gets done on data. If there's no data, then there's no evidence to say why that money is needed. So at the moment, the evidence is saying we need to tackle male-specific gangs and male influences and roles within gangs. And if you look at policy, it's very minimal to say, you know, actually we need to start targeting females. They'll say it in regards to, and on the same line, it will be exploitation and females. It will be, you know, CSE females or something like that, or grooming or so on and so forth. But there's nothing that specifically says we need to target female gangs and what's going on with these group of women or girls. And I think that's making, and that would make a difference, and it's causing a problem. The lack of data is causing a problem to where the focus is, and therefore girls just slip under the net. And then you end up in a situation where, you know, you use girls more, or you recruit girls more because you know they can slip under the net in regards to collecting data or being caught and being charged, and then the narrative getting put out there in society. You know, if you talk to, and the media is very, very bad at doing this, but you know the media is good at kind of shaping society stereotypes and typologies. But if you say gang, straight away there's an image of a black man, or black boys, shall I say. Black boys look in a certain way in a certain area. And if you put next to it an image of a white boy, it's almost like the narrative's completely different. And that's just the way, and this is, I'm really generalizing here, but this is just what the media put out there. But if the media would stop racializing gangs, then society would have a better understanding, funds would have a better understanding, and it can just be channeled in the appropriate way and direction.
No, I love that, because I'm even just thinking about my own, like, because I've just started to get into youth work, and it's just like the amount of things that my mind's been programmed to kind of see and not see. And it's even when I'm reading like Carla at the moment, and it's like as soon as you mention the word gangs, that's the image that comes to your head. It's almost like we've been programmed now to just see that binary and nothing else. So I think my biggest worry is now, like, because I work with a lot of young people, and if there is a young woman in my groups that is experiencing this life and they want to come out, or they're starting to enter into it, what would be the telltale signs, if there are any, that they are embarking on this path? And how would you go about sort of easing them out of it, or even just broaching the subject? I know it's quite sensitive and you don't necessarily want to push in too quick, but how as a youth worker do you tackle that issue head on in that space when you need to?
And this is where your skill comes into play straight away, because as I said before, not everybody can be a youth worker or is a youth worker. And just like adults, if I don't get a good vibe off you, it's not going to work. I'm not going to tell you nothing. I don't even want to talk to you. I don't want to chat to you today. But that takes time to build that rapport, that honest relationship, so that a young person does disclose or just has a conversation with you. It takes time. And too often, you know, because we're all driven by outcomes and tick boxes and how many, it's like, well, can't you solve it now? No, actually, it might take me about 3 months to build some type of small relationship with that individual, because you know what? It would take me about 3 months as an adult. I wouldn't just invite you to my house or in my conversation. So we need to bear that in mind. But in regards to telltale signs, so from the individual's perspective, from the young female's perspective, sometimes they don't know. Sometimes they're none the wiser, and actually they don't know that they're entering a particular situation, or their character is changing, and there's a reason why your character is changing. But from a specialist perspective, that's when you need to know your individual young people. And not every youth worker can work in any youth setting, because you won't see the telltale signs. It's where your safeguarding comes into play as well. Because you might be looking for something and actually you notice something else, and you need to be able to react on that. And it's things like, if individual A, you know them over the summer to have, not the latest trainers, not the best clothes on, they've normally only got £2 to get their dinner in the after the youth club or something like that, and all of a sudden they're coming in rocking the best garms, or the latest phone, or the hairs did nice, or even they've got a £20 note for dinner that evening. These are little signs where you think, okay, I'm now alerted to the fact there's a change in you. But you can't necessarily do anything about that on day one. because actually you might just have a £20 note today and mom's got paid a bit more and give you something else, or it's your birthday or something. So you need to be easy. You need to also be quite mindful and tactful. But then if you start to see that change continue, then it's your job as as youth worker to, to start to address that situation very subtly. On the flip side, you can have something very direct where, that young woman's having a very open conversation about what they've been up to that weekend or the night before. And that's again where it's your job as a youth worker to be able to infiltrate that conversation, because now you've got to safeguard that individual, but everybody else who's they're talking to, because you don't know what they've disclosed and you don't know who they've now put in harm by sharing certain information. So you've got to remove that individual from the group and have a frank conversation with them. You have to know your young person. I really enjoyed working in youth clubs when I did, because sometimes a situation would happen and I'd have to call a colleague, not because I'm not equipped to deal with it. I don't have the rapport with that individual, but I've heard the conversation. I know exactly what's going on, but I know if I step to her or him, they're just going to shut down, back off, and tell me something that I actually don't want to hear. So I just call another colleague. Working with young people, it's a group thing, it's a collective thing. You all work together, you all bounce off one another. Some nights are hard, some nights you have a laugh, but at the end of the day, you are there to safeguard these young people. And things like language, you need to be mindful of. You also need to be mindful of if you've got a young person that comes to youth club every Friday and all of a sudden you don't see them for 3 weeks. Where are they? And again, that's where you'd have the rapport with friends of that individual to say, is so-and-so okay? Or on the youth worker phone, if you're able to text that individual just to say, oh, you're right, I haven't saw you in 3 weeks, and so on and so forth, without putting that individual in harm's way. And obviously, your obvious kind of, direct signs, and then therefore safeguarding sets into place straight away. But I think it's the more subtle, less obvious, new phone, new hair, aggressive language, or even just a change in the way that individual speaks to say, okay, something's changed in your life. I'm aware, and I need to know whether I need to be alerted to something. Could just be got a new boyfriend, an appropriate aged boyfriend, and they're happy and so on. Or they've got a boyfriend and they just had an argument, or they're battling with their sexuality, or they've had a pregnancy scare, or there's so much, because you can't just put it down to gangs straight away. So you have to do your work, and therefore that's where your expert comes in. That's where your youth expertise comes in. And again, not, as I said before, not every person who thinks they can be a youth worker can be a youth worker.
Yeah, you definitely got to be really skilled, or just to be honest, just be kind of the right person, like just naturally have the right conversation skills, or not be too much or too little or whatever. But say if you've ever had experience where somebody hasn't even, like, maybe they're not old enough to enter a gang, or they haven't yet. What do you feel that, like, gangs, say if they're looking to, like, recruit individuals in or get individuals in, say if they were specifically looking for vulnerable girls or vulnerable young people, what do you think what is the formula maybe to recruit these individuals?
People who are kind of, as you'd say, at the top level of the gang, who's controlling the situation, they're very smart. People sometimes think, they're uneducated and they don't know anything and so on and so forth. But to be able to pull this off, you've got to be a smart individual. And you said something about they may be too young to join a gang. Actually, the age of those being recruited are becoming younger and younger, unfortunately. And gangs are very clued up to know if you get somebody at the age of, I don't know, 9, 10, criminal record wise, they don't really have one. So therefore, if they get caught with something, it's not as detrimental and devastating as the 18-year-old getting caught with the exact same thing. Yes, we need to be concerned and the police get involved and so on and so forth, but the outcome is different. So at the moment, how young is too young? It's getting younger and younger in regards to, recruiting members to be part of gangs or just supporting or helping out. And then, if you kind of stop and think, there's young girls out there that don't realize that the house that they're brought up in is a house that's, involved in gang criminal activity. But your uncle so-and-so comes round all the time and gives your dad something. You have no idea what it is because you're not old enough yet to kind of know what it is, but you know that this transaction happens every Friday because every Friday you have chips, and every time you're eating your chips, the same man comes along and gives your dad something. Right there, that 6-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old may not have the terminology yet, but they're very aware something's going on. They probably don't know, to what extent or how criminal it is, but they're very aware something's going on. It's only when you get to a certain age you think, wow, actually, something happened in my house when I was younger, and now I know what it was. So, sorry, I forgot what your first question. I do go off on one. What was your question in the first place?
No. Everything you've been saying is such good points. Anyway, it's really interesting to listen to. So it's just like, what's the formula when to recruit vulnerable young girls or young boys? Like, what would a gang do? Like, what in order to recruit a vulnerable, like even if it's a child, like 9 or 10, what would they do?
I think, I'm not the head of a gang, so I don't know the exact, how you go forward and so on and so forth. But I think the fact that they're a young person in itself is right at the forefront of the formula, that we need to make sure these people are young, and by them being young, they're vulnerable automatically because the law says so. And then from certain, and I was going to say something and I'm correcting myself. I was going to say from certain areas makes them even more vulnerable. However, we're very aware that gangs are not just an inner city thing, and that gang activity also is not just happening in these big major cities, and that, you travel, 10 miles somewhere, that there's still activity, drugs, gangs, guns, so on and so forth, exploitation happening in what we would call the countryside, but actually it's happening everywhere. It's just, it's undercover, or the attention and the focus is so concentrated on your Birmingham, Manchester, Leicester's, whatever, that you're forgetting that, 10 miles out of Leicester, they're being supplied with the exact same thing, but we don't focus on there. Or 10 miles out of Birmingham, because 10 miles out of Birmingham is your very nice, affluent, big houses, good schools, so on and so forth. But yeah, it's in there as well, but nobody focuses on that, and the narrative's not around that, because I could go a bit deeper to say, because that's exactly how those at the top want you to keep that narrative as inner city black boys, basically, and they don't want to change that description of gang members. But I think there's a lot more into it, and it's not just as easy as going, do you want to, I was going to say, do you want to be in my gang? It's very calculative, it's very smart, it's very manipulative, without that individual, without that young person necessarily knowing what is happening to them. It was so funny because when we've done our research on girls and gangs, we stripped it right down to the core of what is a gang, how has this happened, how is it formulated. And I was talking to a manager of a youth club, and we said, like, do you remember when you was little in primary school and you had a group of friends and you'd put your arms around their shoulders and you'd walk around the playground going, do you want to be in my gang? Do you want to be in our gang? And you thought that you was the business. And that was just that was just narratives that we all did as little kids. And how has it changed now to becoming gang means guns, knife, murder? Because we focus so much on the extreme violence, we're forgetting about the more subtle ABH, mental, psychological violence as well that happens within a gang to other members to exploit them, to create more victims, and so on. Yeah.
I suppose our last question, which is, I mean, I know that there could be some women that are watching this that are probably in a gang and they don't know how to get out, and probably they don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. So do you have any, because I know you mentioned earlier about a young woman that was kind of being into a gang and then she's now in college and she's now getting back on track with her life. Do you have any other, I don't even want to call it a success story, but like a light at the end of the tunnel story where you've seen women come out on the other end and they are happy and they're free?
I do. I have many, and that's nice that actually I have many in my head to think, oh, do you remember so and so? And oh, she's all right now because she's, you know, she's got a young baby and they've moved out and they get themselves together. But to get to that stage, there's so many layers. There's so many layers. It's a multidisciplinary intervention that is needed. And yes, it could start off with the youth worker. However, that youth worker needs support. That youth worker doesn't have access to, you know, housing or shelters or food banks, or you've got to call in the other agencies who are specialists in their field. And that's important as well for everybody to be working together. And, you know, I've been doing this for such a long time, working with young people, vulnerable, disadvantaged young people who, you know, got themselves in some really bad, sticky situations. And you just remember the ones where they were so caught up or so low and so bad that you thought, how on earth are they going to get out of this? And you kind of remember, okay, I see why you're doing that, because actually, if you go home, there's violence at home, there's no food at home. So go into that house, provide you with warmth, shelter, safety, and food. So what we need to do is create another space where you can access that same security that you're getting from, you know, the house that's not necessarily a good thing for you, and be able to have it somewhere else. And that is work. And that's work with just one individual. And it's not just one girl who needs help. And then it's which bit do you tackle first? Do you tackle the fact that they are doing extremely poor in school, they've been excluded, they're in, you know, pupil referral units, blah, blah, blah. Do you tackle their education first, knowing that actually nobody can't learn anything if your environment ain't right anyway? What do you tackle first? Which crime, which bit of exploitation, which criminal act? You know, they've got court on Tuesday, but they need to do that run on Friday, because if they don't, there's consequences. It's work that needs to be done by experts with the support of other experts through multidisciplinary relationships and teams. But in all of it, it needs funding. It needs funding. And we know over the years, especially with austerity and so on, you know, the youth sector at large has been stripped. And for a lot of these young girls, the youth club was their sanctuary. The rapport they have with the youth workers, you know, some of their relationships are stronger than what they have with their parents or their sisters or so on and so forth. When you've pulled that away, it then becomes the youth workers have to do outreach, but you can't necessarily cover as much ground on your foot. When the young people come to you, it's a little bit easier. But when you need to walk up and down certain areas and, you know, you're only getting paid to do that for 2.5 hours, more than likely you end up working over anyway, because it just, you know, the world doesn't work like that. But you know that you haven't been able to see as many as you have. My success stories are young girls going to university, young girls learning how to drive. You know, I even have them pop up and say, oh my gosh, Shardia, look at you. Do you remember when? And I always remember when, or, you know, having opportunities, international opportunities we've had, some of our young women have, and that was absolutely great. But I think one of the most success stories that I'll never forget is the Girls and Gangs project that Asabi and I did. And the fact that we were oversubscribed. It was just Asabi and I and volunteers, and we thank them so much. And the fact that they committed for over a year, coming to the youth centre on a weekly basis, in the winter as well, to come and be part of our group to try and establish that history of girls and gangs, which also gave them a sense of belonging. And the girls created and formed such great relationships with one another and so on and so forth. They supported one another. The older ones became like little mother hens to the younger ones, and they looked up to it. And you know what? For the time of that project, those girls, and I'm going to say for the majority of the time, kept out of trouble. And when there was trouble, they phoned us, and we got involved and we intervened where we could. And the success stories of that, because also for young people to commit to something for over 12 months, that's a big ask. And it's awful when then the project stops because it's finished, because it was a 2-year project, and the money stops. But the girls' lives don't stop, or the boys' lives don't stop. They still need the intervention. And I think that's where, when we talk about funding, that's where the funders need to kind of look at what they're doing. It's, you know, it's not good enough to do a 1 year, a 12-month project on trying to solve youth violence. Because then what happens after 1 year and a day? The project's pulled. And actually what happens is you get additional labour onto the workers of that project, because you can't just leave them. It's unethical just to leave them and say, okay, I'm done now, thank you, and move on, because it leaves them in a dangerous situation. So, you know, funders need to start looking at to fund things longer than a year or 2 years and so on. Funders need to look at, it's not necessarily about numbers, because for our Girls and Gangs project, we had, I think we had just under 20 girls taking part of the project on a regular basis. But however, our reach was more than that. And, you know, the exhibition conference we did at the end and reached out to more than that. But do we get a pat on the back because we worked with 20 girls for more than a year intensely and, you know, gave them research and support and so on and so forth? But actually, would we get a bigger tap on the back if we pulled in figures like 500? And a lot of funders work on figures, and that's a problem. It needs to be impact, not figures. So for us, that's what we did. We worked on impact rather than figures. And you know, we've got one of the girls is, you know, does football. She's in a football club, and it was just amazing. And it's amazing now that these girls are not girls anymore; they're women, and we see them, and they see us, and you know, you can tell you made a difference in that individual's life, and they let you know you made a difference, but without necessarily saying you made a difference. Just by who they are now, you know that was because of your intervention at a particular time. So yeah.
Wow. Shardia, I could literally speak to you all day. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if people want to know like more about you, where they can find you, do you have any social media platforms or an email address that a lot of people could probably get in touch with you at?
Yes, social media wise, you can find me at the Twitter handle is Shardia B Palmer, or you can find me on my website WordPress, which is Shardia B Palmer at wordpress.com. I'll send you the link so you can put that out there. But yeah, I'm more than happy to you know, speak to anybody who wants to find out more, or you know, anybody who's going through something where they think, you know what, I could actually do with a conversation, because that's what it's about, isn't it? Offering time, and that's what I'm offering, time.
That's it. Thank you so much. And
Thank
guys who are watching, don't forget to follow us too. You can learn more about what we're doing by following us on the OnPoint WM on Instagram and also the hashtag ThriveCasters. Hit us up. Let us know what you thought about today's episode of Girls and Gangs. And thanks for tuning in. Join us next time for more conversations that matter to you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks.
Don't forget to follow us on social media at OnPointWM and hashtag ThriveCasters. Join us next time for more conversations that matter to you.